There's a housing crisis in San Diego, yet the Housing Commission has nearly $300 million in unspent funds. The commission says there's a reason for that. El Cajon is cracking down on the homeless living on city streets. Mexican authorities are working with the FBI to halt sex trafficking of children in Tijuana. And a lawsuit challenging California's anti-prostitution law on constitutional grounds has reached federal court. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Watchdog reporter James DeHaven of the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, James.
Hi, Mark.
Good to have you back again today. KPBS reporter Susan Murphy. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Mark. Good to be here.
We're glad you're here. Christina Davis, who covers crime and public safety for the Union Tribune. Hi, Christina.
Hello.
Glad you're back. And legal affairs editor Dana Littlefield of the Union Tribune. Hi, Dana.
Hi, Mark.
Glad you're here today. Well, San Diego's twin scourges, homelessness and lack of affordable housing, were brought into sharp relief by the hepatitis A outbreak this year. It's the job of the city's Housing Commission to help provide low-cost housing. Critics of the agency say it's sitting on a pile of cash even as rents continue to soar and the housing crisis worsens. But the commission says there's a good reason for that. Here's Housing Commission head Rick Gentry a few months ago talking about the number of people in need of housing.
We've got 75,000 applicants for 15,000 occupied units with a turnover rate of about 100 a month. You can do the math. The thing I don't know how to predict is what the growth and the problem is going to continue to be despite all the efforts and attentions that we're given to it.
So the present situation is bad, future could be worse. It's a very complicated story. James, start with how much money the Housing Commission has on hand.
Roughly $279 million reported as of fiscal year 2016. I saw their latest annual report yesterday put the total unrestricted net position at 299 or 300 million.
Okay, so it sounds like a ton of money. We're going to get into the details of how that breaks down and what the commission says about that. How does this agency accumulate funds?
They get a lot of money from the feds, from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They put a lot of that money into housing vouchers, which go out to the community, and as Rick mentioned, they have a lengthy waiting list to use them, in part due to the housing shortage.
Mm-hmm.
But
years long in cases.
Yeah, years long. But the way that the unrestricted net position piles up is they just don't manage to spend all the money that they take in every year. Something like $27 million in an average year is what goes into the reserves because they just don't spend it.
Okay, and what are they supposed to do to spend that money, money that they collect?
Depends on who you ask. I mean, they could use it via their own in-house development company to build a bunch of new affordable housing units. They could use it to offer new incentives to developers, new loans, new grants. There's any number of ways you could put that money out on the streets.
And you mentioned a typical year, 27 million. So if you collect that last year, let's say, that's enough. We've had this temporary housing shelter situation now. Mm-hmm. That's enough to house, at least on the temporary basis, a lot of people, right?
It's enough, by my calculations, to house about 8,000 people. Mm-hmm. Which is almost everyone that's out on the streets right now.
Almost everybody.
So.
Susan?
Yeah, and we got an email from Councilman Alvarez this morning, and he said that it's going to cost for a family of four $5,000 per month for these temporary sprung structures, these big industrial-sized tents. That seems pretty pricey.
I believe that's with the Housing Commission running it, or at least factoring in Alpha Project or some other nonprofit doing it. I remember when the tent idea first came around, and these are the numbers I used in the story. Dan Shea and Peter Seidler said it was going to be something like $200,000 to put him out there. Mm-hmm. And so that's the number that I used as far as how many people you could stuff under those. Mm-hmm. In terms of ongoing operating costs, it could be much higher.
Mm-hmm. And initially they said there were going to be about 100 people per tent, and now they're saying about 400.
Yeah.
So maybe that has something to do with it.
They seem to have grown, which is good.
Yeah. Well, your story notes that the commission reported it funded fewer than 20% of the low-income rental units it hoped to finance over the past year, and the shortfall's been going on for a while, right? Yeah. They don't meet these goals.
Yeah, so the funding source for that is developer fees that are collected from builders who aren't going to add affordable housing units to a market rate project. The Housing Commission collects those so they themselves can use them to build affordable housing units. But over the past 5 or 6 fiscal years, they've consistently fallen short of meeting their goal for new rental housing construction using those funds.
And that probably is due to the difficulty of building in this market, finding space and all the costs involved?
I think that has a lot to do with it. The Housing Commission itself has said that it's project delays, in part due to financing complications. Oftentimes these deals involve private financing from, banks all the way up to Wall Street or whoever. And then you combine that with state financing. It's very complicated. So they say that that is the primary reason why these things tend to take longer than they would like them to.
Okay, and you've gotten some pushback from the agency. They say this $279 million on hand, largely committed already, and they say it's misleading. They say that they're really sitting on a pile of cash. What's the Housing Commission's explanation of this?
Well, essentially they say that all the money that they, or the vast majority of the money that they have in this unrestricted net position is already in some form dedicated or committed to a development project, or is going to be used for a project in the future. They also say a lot of the stuff out there is loans in the unrestricted net position. They haven't been able to show me in their financial reports where those loans are and when they were made and who they go to. But essentially they say all this money is tied up. It isn't as unrestricted as you might think.
And what's been the position of Mayor Kevin Faulkner and City Council leaders about regarding the Housing Commission and how they're addressing these goals of subsidizing more affordable housing?
Silence, as far as I know.
So yeah, they haven't been some great critics on the
No.
council saying we've got to spend more and get more.
David Alvarez has occasionally criticized the approach, as has Councilman Chris Ward, a couple others. But by and large, the Housing Commission goes up, presents their facts and figures, and they don't go really thoroughly questioned by the City Council and the Mayor.
With all this extra
Susan?
money in the pot, it seems last winter, I remember when it rained and when it was a little bit cold, they had to meet the certain threshold. They oversee these shelters too. So, it seems like a drop in the bucket to be able to put people into a shelter for one night, and here they have all this money.
Yeah.
Yeah, because part of the mission, if you look at the statement and on their website, is to react to emergencies such as you're describing there, Susan. And it would seem like they'd have ready cash to jump right in on that.
I would think so, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of citizens wonder, and we had these stories last year during that stormy winter of why it takes so long to get these things up and going when there's people out there and the weather's turning bad. So your story notes that since 2005, according to financial reports, the money owed to the agency by developers increased 180%, and the number of new affordable housing units permitted for construction dropped by 53%. It seems like they're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, it seems actually when you look really close at the reports, like they're making fewer loans and not collecting all the money that perhaps they're owed on those loans, and they've been docked for that by the city auditor in the past, who has questioned them and said, look, you guys have all this interest out there that you could collect. It doesn't seem like maybe you're collecting it, and perhaps you should. They contended that as well at the time.
Well, let's talk about specifically what were the Housing Commission kind of point by point had a response to your article. What were some of the key things that they were saying that, and again, it is a very complicated issue. Your story was long and thorough and complicated for newspaper stories these days.
Sure.
But there's a whole ton about this story and the bureaucratic hurdles in this agency.
I think probably the key thing they mentioned is something I already mentioned, which is that they claim that half or a little over half of this unrestricted fund balance is out in the form of loans to developers who are using those monies, presumably, which is great. But again, they have not identified for me on the reports which loans those are, which developers they went to, et cetera. They just say, here's the number, you subtract this, this is how much we have out on the street. So if you take that at face value, then it looks the number is a lot smaller.
And we have there's loans we're talking about and grants here. What's the difference there?
Yes, that's another point that critics have made, is that the Housing Commission makes all these loans when in fact they could just throw the money at developers, but they wouldn't be able to keep the property. They would have no further claim to the property.
So they want to continue with a leverage on it then.
They do, and the president and CEO of the Housing Commission, Rick Gentry, has said that he would like to see them create a legacy with these loans. I'm not entirely sure what he means by that, but so far that has meant them amassing a huge amount of money that developers owe them in exchange for, as you mentioned earlier, not all that many housing units being built.
Do you see this coming up, especially as we've said at the outset, with the housing crisis, the homelessness crisis, the HEP situation? Do you see this coming up and getting more attention, that is the Housing Commission and its funding and its fund use before the council?
I do, yeah. I think the moment is ripe for, especially politically, for certain folks on the city council to start taking a harder look at these issues. And I've noticed that just even since the story has come out, just a minor uptick in interest, it seems, in what the Housing Commission is doing.
All right. Well, we'll see in following up and what happens and what discussion this portends. I appreciate that. Well, as in San Diego and other areas, the homeless population is soaring in El Cajon, but the suburb in East San Diego County is taking a tough approach, which is drawing fire from the homeless and advocates for those on the street. Here's El Cajon Mayor Frank Wells on what the city is doing.
We're not going to let people have tents on the streets. We're not going to let tent cities grow up. We're not going to let people just sleep wherever they want to sleep. We're going to maintain some rules and some discipline.
All right, Susan, start with the measures. What are the high points of the approach that they're taking in El Cajon?
So one of the newest measures is this kind of anti-panhandling rule. They have posted these permanent signs in a couple dozen intersections across the city of El Cajon, and it basically discourages people from giving money directly to people holding cardboard signs, and instead it encourages people to donate to nonprofit and homeless outreach nonprofits in the city, where the money could be used, to help them in a broader way. And the reason behind that is because the city leaders and the mayor says that it's fueling, drug addictions, that many of the people who are living on the streets of El Cajon have drug problems. There's opioid crisis, and he says that is, one of the biggest, reasons for homelessness rising in the city. And we do have a cut from him explaining that.
Okay, let's go to that then.
If you're giving somebody $10 and you're hoping they're going to use it for food, I understand that. That makes a lot of sense to me. But the reality is they're not using it for food. They're using it for crystal methamphetamines. They're using it for alcohol. They're using it for opiates. And all these things perpetuate homelessness, and they perpetuate diseases like hepatitis A.
All right, now some churches have been giving the homeless handouts, offering free food at City Park there, Wells Park, coincidentally named. And that's going to change too, right?
Yes, so they last week introduced an ordinance prohibiting churches and outreach groups from serving meals to groups of homeless people on city property, like parks. And Wells Park was one of these areas where basically they would serve upwards of 30 meals a week. Churches, outreach groups would come and set up these potluck-style picnics, and they would serve homeless people. Well, they're not allowed to do that anymore. They say that hepatitis A is spread from fecal matter from the hand to the mouth, and they say that, food needs to be prepared and served in a more sanitary way. So they have cut that off. And I did talk to some church organizations who have participated in this every week for years. They're trying to look for new solutions, new creative ways to reach out to homeless people. So last Saturday, for example, they handed out some gift cards and they gave clothing. They say the one big thing that's missing, though, is kind of the fellowship, the interaction with these people, finding out who they are, what their story is, so that they can better help them. So,
were the church groups opposed to this restriction on, or where you have to start cooking the food now, apparently?
They are disappointed because they feel that it's not right for them to be told that they can't do this. It is a public space, and that they should be able to, help their neighbors who are in need. They do understand, some of the reasons behind it, but they do want to have. One pastor I talked to said, he really wants to sit down at a table and have a conversation because they need to be heard and they need to share their perspective on this issue.
Now, this is a different philosophy and approach that other places have taken, right?
Yeah, well, the aggressive enforcement, the no tents, the police, we've seen that in downtown San Diego, especially recently. We had our city streets covered in tents in some East Village areas, and now those have been cleared out. We've seen caravans of police, 12 long, clearing out homeless encampments. So we have seen that aggressive enforcement, major citations, arrests. That's happening in El Cajon too. The thing we haven't seen in downtown San Diego, we haven't seen these anti-panhandling signs yet. And I've been down there recently. I have seen outreach groups serving meals, on some of these East County streets. So that is still happening.
Now they've also got some restrictions now, tougher rules to comply with for those who want to have services, right?
Basically, they say that people are on the streets because they are drug addicts, because they can't break this cycle of being addicted to opioids and other drugs. And so their restrictions are, we want to get you off the streets, but you have to adhere to our rules and regulations. They do have programs to help people get clean. They have to be willing to get into these programs. The mayor told me that they are pouring money into lots of services and resources. They have an app now where people can find homeless services easily. They're pouring money into housing and shelter. Their biggest shelter is a 2-story motel in the East County, and it's called the Transitional Living Center. There are about 300 people who live there. I was there earlier this year, and the list, though, is about 120 names long. So I don't know how easy it is for someone in El Cajon to get into a shelter.
It just seems to
Christina?
me like those are all really good goals to have, but you're going to have such a large segment of the population who just is not ready for those services yet. And what do you do with them? You end up driving them elsewhere.
Right, San Diego
right?
tends to
Criminalize
recognize
them.
what Christina's saying, right?
Right,
Their
and
approach.
they take the trolley and they go to different areas, and people that I talk to, homeless people that I talk to, are very angry. Many of them broke down crying when they were talking about, like, the meals, for instance. It's something they really depend on. One person said he's been homeless since he was a child. He said these recent ordinances have just dug him into a deeper hole, that he's never felt so hopeless. They just go on and on. In fact, a woman I was talking to in the middle of our interview, and she was telling me that she was feeling, her words were black sheeped from the community. She said that during our interview, a police officer rolled up and kind of broke out their group and told them to move along. So she wasn't able to even finish her thought because police were, pushing them away. So,
Well, we'll follow up and see how this approach works and what happens going forward in that city and, of course, in San Diego and elsewhere. Well, we're going to move on now. It's a grim story involving middle-aged American men working through Tijuana sex brokers who traffic in young girls. Now the FBI has renewed its efforts to stop the trafficking of children and is working with Mexican authorities. Christina, your story opens with a chilling email from a man wanting to hook up with a child. What was the story there?
Yeah, so I found 2 cases quite recently. I cover federal courts, and I found these 2 cases, and they were completely chilling to me. And they were linked together by the same sex broker, and I thought it was really important to use these men's words in the story as much as I could. And they're basically Southern California men who travel down frequently to Tijuana to have sex with children as young as 8, 9, 10. That kind of was the target age of both of these cases.
Yeah, that was particularly shocking in your story.
Yes, and human trafficking has become such a big issue, I feel like nowadays, especially in San Diego County, across the nation. A lot of times we're talking about teenagers being sold online by gangs and Craigslist type things, which is horrifying in and of itself. And then when you start to look deeper into these really young children and what's going on and what's being allowed to happen down in Tijuana, it's shocking.
So how are the FBI and the Mexican authorities cooperating now? I mean, who would make the arrests? Where does the case go?
Those are great questions that the FBI didn't really want to answer when I interviewed them.
It's early enough that it hasn't come to pass in the courts.
Right. So yeah, both these specific cases are very early on in this stages in court. So hopefully that'll more come to light. But from my understanding, it's an American who tipped off the FBI that there was this sex broker down in Tijuana who was setting up these meetings. And
through the web, as you said, and kind of what they call the dark web. I mean, kind of hidden
I'm not
sites
sure
on the web.
exactly how you find him, how the customers are finding him. A lot of times these are like through word of mouth and everything too. But yeah, the dark web, and you can find anything terrible you want on the dark web. But it sounds like with help from the Mexican authorities and the FBI, and the FBI does have agents around the world, so they do have agents in Mexico. They were able to find and talk to this man, and it looks like they've they got his little black book, so to say, and we might see some more cases
You got a case with
from him.
And then these young girls, according to the authorities, who are they? Where do they come from?
They come from all over Mexico. They could be stolen. I mean, some of the text messages in these cases, the broker indicates that he's got brand new girls, fresh girls, recently stolen. I mean, really, really terrible things to think about. There are towns in central Mexico that actually focus on human trafficking as an industry, and kind of these organizations, and they'll bring them up to the border regions or to other vacation spots like Cancun is also a hotbed for this kind of thing.
Now, there was a hopeful note in the story about this new program in this court that's trying to help the victims of sex trafficking.
Right, and that's shifting a little bit more to what's happening in San Diego County. There's a new court called Rise Court that just started, and it's an intervention court. So you've probably heard of a drug court and homeless court and things like that, where they have kind of the same group of caseworkers who's very experienced in this area, and then one judge who hears all of these cases. And it's kind of like, we will dismiss your criminal charges and help you move on and start afresh, but there's also some programs that you need to complete, get your education, get job training, make sure you're in counseling, and they track your progress. So this is going to be for juveniles right now is what they're starting at, victims of sex trafficking.
All right, it'd be interesting to see how this all works out as they go along. We're going to turn now to a completely different aspect of the sex trade, prostitution on this side of the border involving consenting adults. Dana, your story involves a push to legalize prostitution, and who's behind this? And they're claiming some rights in this case, right?
Yes. Well, there is an advocacy group out of San Francisco, the Erotic Service Providers Legal Education and Research Project. It's a very long name. And they filed a lawsuit back in 2015, essentially saying, the lawsuit was filed in Northern California, essentially saying that they are being denied their constitutional right to work as prostitutes. My understanding is that the lawsuit was filed on behalf of two people who identify as prostitutes and a third person, I believe it's a disabled man, who would be a customer. And so what is being argued here is that their free speech rights are being infringed upon because solicitation, saying that you are a prostitute and actually the act of like arranging the situation is a crime.
And they're saying that's protected speech.
Exactly right. Yes, and basically they're saying that their due process rights are being stepped on and their right to freedom of association.
Now, this law goes back a long way
yes.
in California. The attorney, H. Lewis Sirkin, if I'm pronouncing that right, he says there's some precedent here that he's citing in his legal arguments, right?
Well, basically, he was making the argument to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that that the conduct itself is protected. And essentially, he was arguing that the act between two people is essentially a relationship. For the time that occurs, that's a relationship, and that is protected. And the precedent that he cited had to do with Lawrence v. Texas, which was a Supreme Court decision that struck down Texas's sodomy law.
Yeah, famous decision, right?
Famous decision, absolutely.
So the backers of this are trying to be clear. This is not talking about sex with minors and trafficking and what we were talking about in the previous segment. And how convincing is that argument? Is that one of the state's counter arguments there, that children will get invariably involved?
Well, yes, that's part of their argument. So those Sirkin arguing on behalf of this advocacy group for the prostitutes is basically saying, he said that from the outset during oral arguments in front of the court. He said, this is not about children, trafficking children. This is not about, roping somebody into this work, children or adults who are not willing to go into this type of profession. This is about people who want to do this, and this is how they choose to make their living and should be able to do so. The state, though, is basically saying, well, there are a number of quote-unquote evils that come from prostitution, human trafficking, sex trafficking being one of them. And so there seems to be no willingness to strike down a law that's been on the books for 145 years because of what other things could come out of it.
All right, a couple seconds left. Chances of this prevailing?
I think those chances might be pretty slim.
Pretty slim. All right, we'll take a look and see what happens on that case. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, James DeHaven of the San Diego Union Tribune, Susan Murphy of KPBS News, Christina Davis, also of the Union Tribune, and Dana Littlefield, rounding out our group with the Union Tribune today. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.